That day began like any other. I had returned home from a 12-hour shift in the surgical ward at St. Mary's Hospital in downtown Boston. It was 8:45 p.m. when I opened the door to my 15th-floor apartment. Fatigue washed over me in waves. 3 complex surgeries in a row can wear out even the most experienced surgeon. All I wanted was a hot shower and a good night's sleep. I dropped my keys carelessly into the glass bowl on the table by the door, a habit I had left over from my time with Emily. She always insisted on having a place for everything. The thought left a dull ache in my chest, as it always does when I think of her. 2 years have passed, and it's not getting any easier. As I passed the dining table, I noticed an envelope. White, thick, with gold lettering around the edges. Odd. I distinctly remembered that it wasn't there this morning. Mrs. Parker, my housekeeper, comes on Wednesdays and Saturdays, and today was Thursday. The concierge must have brought the mail straight to the apartment. He has a spare key for such occasions. I picked up the envelope. The paper was expensive, with a textured surface that felt good under my fingers. My address was written in calligraphic handwriting, in black ink. Dr. Michael Donovan, it read. There was no return address. At that moment, I didn't know that this letter would change my whole life. I tore open the envelope, pulled out the thick cardboard inside, and my world froze. A wedding invitation. Emily was getting married. To James Holloway. James fucking Holloway. The man who ruined my marriage. A successful Wall Street financier with a perfect smile and a reputation that I now know conceals something far more sinister. Back then, all I saw was the glossy cover, the charismatic businessman, philanthropist, trustee of several charities. The perfect man, according to Emily. I sank into a chair, still holding the invitation. My vision swam, the room began to spin. The wedding date was in a month. St. Patrick's Church in Midtown Manhattan. A lavish reception at the Plaza Hotel. Everything she had always dreamed of. Our wedding was more modest. We were interns, barely making ends meet, but we were happy. At least, I thought so. 15 years of marriage. 15 years that now seemed like an illusion. I stood up, walked over to the bar, and poured myself a double scotch. The alcohol burned my throat but didn't bring relief. Memories swirled in my head, meeting Emily in medical school, our first apartment, her decision to quit surgery to practice dermatology, the first signs that something was wrong in our relationship. And then there he was. James Holloway. A new client at her clinic. Small talk turned into meetings, meetings into dinners. I was too busy pursuing my career to notice I was losing it. By the time I saw the light, it was too late. We're just friends, Michael. You work too much, I feel lonely. Her words echoed in my memory. And then there was the divorce. Quick, painless, at least legally. She didn't want my money, I didn't fight for marital property. All I wanted was for her to be happy. And now this invitation. Like the final nail in the coffin of our relationship. I looked at the clock, almost midnight. I couldn't sleep anymore. I went to the window, looking out at the lights of Boston at night. Somewhere out there, in a luxurious penthouse in Manhattan, Emily was planning the wedding of her dreams. To a man I hated. I took out my phone and opened my contacts. Her number was still there, even though I hadn't called in over a year. My finger hovered over the call button. What would I say? Congratulations. Be careful. I miss you. In the end, I just turned off the phone and walked back to the bar. A sleepless night lay ahead, filled with memories and regrets. But somewhere deep inside, a decision was brewing. I had to find out the truth about James Holloway. Something about him had always seemed wrong, false. And now that he was going to marry Emily, I had a reason to dig deeper. I didn't know then that this decision would lead me to discoveries that would change not only my life, but Emily's as well. And that the price of these discoveries could be too high for all of us. I met Emily at Harvard Medical School in the fall of 2006. She was the brightest student in our class, with golden hair, a sharp mind, and an uncanny ability to put people at ease. I remember our first meeting in the dissection room. She stood over a body, confidently making the first cut, while the other students nervously shifted from foot to foot. Her determination won me over immediately. Our romance developed rapidly. Joint shifts at the hospital, endless hours of studying for exams, coffee from a vending machine at 3 in the morning, all this brought us closer day after day. Within a year, we were already living together in a tiny flat in Cambridge, where our medical textbooks barely fit. Emily joked that our bed was held up by Gray's Anatomy and Principles of Surgery. We got married in our senior year of medical school. It was a small ceremony in the university chapel, with only 30 guests, mostly classmates and close family. Emily wore a simple white dress from a thrift store, but she looked more beautiful than any bride in the world. We vowed to be there for each other, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer. Who knew that being rich would be the beginning of the end? The first years of our marriage were filled with endless work. Internship, residency, first independent surgeries. We hardly saw each other, different shifts, different departments. But when we managed to spend time together, it was real happiness. We dreamed of our own practice, of children, of a house with a white fence. The turning point came in the 7th year of marriage. Emily increasingly talked about how tired she was of endless shifts and emergency calls. Surgery is constant stress, life on the edge. One evening, she confessed that she wanted to change her specialization to dermatology. I was against it. With her talents, becoming a dermatologist seemed a waste of potential. But she insisted on her own. A private practice in a prestigious area of Boston quickly began to bring in serious income. Emily worked with wealthy clients, performed cosmetic procedures, and consulted on skin care. Her workday became standardized, and she had free time. And I continued to disappear in the operating room, saving lives and missing family dinners. James Holloway showed up at her clinic in the spring of 2021. A routine procedure, removing a mole on his neck. He was a few years older than us, wore Brioni suits, and exuded the confidence of a man accustomed to getting whatever he wanted. After the procedure, he asked Emily to advise him on investing in a chain of medical clinics. The business meetings became more frequent. Emily kept mentioning his name in conversations. James recommended a great financial advisor. James invited me to a charity event. James thinks I have the potential to develop a network of clinics. I was too busy working to notice the obvious. A connection had developed between them. The first suspicions arose when Emily began coming home late, smelling of an unfamiliar men's perfume. She attributed it to business dinners, meetings with investors. I wanted to believe. God, how much I wanted to believe. The day I found the messages on her phone, the world fell apart. She had forgotten her gadget at home, and it was blowing up with incoming messages. Miss you, can't wait to see you, you changed my life, James wrote. The history of correspondence went back months. The confrontation was brief. Emily didn't deny the connection. I'm in love, Michael. For the first time in years, I feel truly alive. Her words hit home, shattering everything I'd believed in for the past 15 years. The divorce was quick and quiet. No scandals, no court battles. Emily renounced her claims to my assets. I signed a waiver of my share in her clinic. We divided the property according to a list drawn up by her lawyer. 15 years of marriage fit into a 3-page document. The last time I saw her was at the lawyer's office. She looked happy, rejuvenated. A Cartier watch glittered on her wrist, a gift from James, I later learned. I hope you find happiness, Michael, she said as we parted. I couldn't find the strength to answer. After the divorce, I threw myself into my work. 16-hour shifts, complex surgeries, scientific research, anything to avoid thinking about how easily what I had spent years building could collapse. Colleagues said I had become the best surgeon in the state, but at what cost? And now this wedding invitation. Emily and James will tie the knot in the church where I once placed a ring on her finger. They will swear eternal love, just like we once did. And it would all be fine, if not for one, but I know something about James Holloway that Emily doesn't. And this knowledge keeps me awake at night. I began investigating James Holloway's past the morning after I received the invitation. I took the first day off from the hospital in 2 years. My colleagues were shocked, but I cited family circumstances. In a way, that was true. I started with a simple internet search. James Holloway, 45, managing partner of the investment company, Hollow & Partners. A graduate of the Wharton School of Business, a member of the boards of directors of several charitable foundations. Photos from charity evenings, interviews in Forbes, articles about successful deals. A picture of the ideal businessman. But something was bothering me. Maybe it was the surgeon's professional habit of noticing the smallest details. One of the articles mentioned that Holloway had started his career at a small investment firm in Seattle. However, his official biography on the Hollow & Partners website did not mention Seattle at all. The first discrepancy. I spent a few hours going through Seattle newspaper archives from 2005 to 2010. And I found what I was looking for, a short story in the financial news section. West Coast Investments had gone bankrupt in 2008, leaving investors with millions in losses. James Holloway was mentioned among the company's executives. But the most interesting part was what happened next. I contacted my old college buddy Tom Reynolds, now with the Seattle prosecutor's office. The West Coast Investments case, he asked. Of course I remember. A classic Ponzi scheme. They lured investors with promises of high returns, used the money from new clients to pay off old ones. When the 2008 crisis hit, the pyramid collapsed. What happened to the company's management? I asked, feeling my pulse quicken. The company's founder, Robert Kane, committed suicide the day before his arrest. The other top managers received prison terms. Except for one, a young financier named James Holloway. He managed to leave the state before the investigation began. It was not possible to prove his involvement in the fraud, all the documents were destroyed. I asked Tom to send me all the case materials that remained in the archive. Within an hour, my email was filled with dozens of scanned documents. Witness statements, financial reports, interrogation reports. And photographs, one of a young James Holloway shaking hands with Robert Kane at the opening of the company's new office. I spent the next few days analyzing each document. The picture that emerged was not pretty. West Coast Investments had raised more than $200 million from investors, most of them retirees and small business owners who had believed the promise of a steady income. When the company collapsed, many lost their entire savings. But the most interesting thing I found was in the bank statements. A month before the company went bankrupt, a large sum of money, about $15 million, was transferred to a bank account in the Cayman Islands. The owner of the account was hidden behind a complex network of offshore companies, but I would have bet my degree in surgery that I knew who it was. I decided to dig deeper. I spent several $1,000s on a private investigator in New York. He gave me information about Holloway's current business. Hollow & Partners managed assets worth more than $1 billion. Impressive growth for a company founded only 10 years ago. But something about the company's financial statements didn't add up. The company's returns on investment were consistently high, even during market downturns. It was reminiscent of West Coast Investments. Too good to be true. I started tracking the movement of funds of Hollow & Partners clients. A complex network of transactions through dozens of shell companies. Some of the money went offshore, some came back as investment income. A classic money laundering scheme. One of the company's clients particularly caught my attention, the Medical Research Foundation, Health Future. On paper, it is a non-profit organization engaged in the development of new methods of treatment. In reality, it is a shell with no real activity. Millions of dollars passed through this foundation. And then it hit me. Emily had said that Holloway had offered to invest in the development of a network of clinics through this fund. She had already transferred a significant portion of her savings. Money earned over years of hard work could disappear into offshore accounts. I spent a sleepless night analyzing the information I had gathered. Holloway's scheme was brilliant in its simplicity. He used his reputation as a successful financier and philanthropist to attract new investors. The money would flow through a complex system of companies and funds, masking its real movement. When the time came, he could disappear, leaving investors with nothing, as he had already done in Seattle. But that wasn't the scariest part. As I investigated, I discovered that Emily wasn't the first woman in Holloway's life whose money he planned to steal. In Seattle, he was married to the daughter of one of West Coast Investment's biggest investors. After the company collapsed, she tried to commit suicide. Holloway divorced her a week before he disappeared from town. Now I understood that marrying Emily was part of his plan. To gain control of her assets, use her reputation as a successful doctor to attract new investors, and then history could repeat itself. I sat in my office, looking at the documents laid out. The evidence was compelling, but not absolute. Holloway was too smart to leave any direct evidence. But I knew I had to act, for Emily and all the other potential victims of this con man. The first order of business was to find his ex-wife. If she agreed to tell her story, it might be the key to exposing Holloway. I booked the next flight to Seattle. Time was against me, the wedding was less than a month away. Seattle greeted me with pouring rain. I arrived early in the morning and headed straight to the suburb of Bellevue, where, according to my detective, Sarah Holloway, James's ex-wife, lived. She never changed her last name after the divorce, which struck me as odd. Sarah's house was a modest one-story cottage with a small garden. Nothing like the luxurious apartment she had lived in during her marriage to Holloway. I parked my rental car across the street and sat for a while, collecting my thoughts. What would I tell her? How would I explain my presence? The solution came naturally. A car pulled into the driveway. A woman in her 40s stepped out, elegant even in simple casual clothes. She was carrying bags of groceries. I got out of the car and walked toward her. "Mrs. Holloway?" I called out. "My name is Michael Donovan. I need to talk to you about James." She froze. The bag slipped from her hands, the oranges rolled on the wet asphalt. I rushed to help collect the scattered products. "Come in," she said quietly, after a pause. "I think we really need to talk." Inside, the house was cozy, if modest. On the walls were photographs of the little girl at different ages. Her daughter, as I learned later. In the living room stood an old piano, covered with notes. "Do you teach music?" I asked, trying to start a conversation. "Yes, at the local art school," Sarah replied, putting the kettle on. "After everything that's happened, it helps keep you afloat. But you're not here for small talk, are you?" I took a folder of documents and a photo of Emily out of my briefcase. "James is going to marry this woman. She was my wife." Sarah stared at the photo for a long moment. Her hands shook slightly. "Beautiful. Successful, apparently. That's the kind he likes. The ones with something to lose." Over the next 2 hours, I heard a story that would make my blood run cold. Sarah met James in 2006. She was the heiress to her father's fortune, a construction company owner. She quickly became smitten with the handsome, charming financier. "He knows how to make a woman feel special," Sarah said, looking out the window at the rain. Expensive gifts, attention to detail, romantic surprises. I thought I'd met a prince from a fairy tale. After the wedding, James convinced her father to invest a significant portion of the family's assets in West Coast investments. This was followed by persuasion to hand over the management of her personal trust fund to the company. I didn't immediately understand what was going on. James always had a way of explaining any financial manipulations so that they seemed absolutely logical. He talked about risk diversification, about high-yield investments, about capital protection. And I just believed my husband. When the company went bankrupt, Sarah's family lost almost everything. Her father died of a heart attack in his lawyer's office when he learned the true extent of his losses. I took a whole bottle of sleeping pills that night, Sarah said calmly, as if she were talking about someone else's life. I was saved by the housekeeper, who came earlier than usual. And James, he didn't even come to the hospital. A week later, I got divorce papers. She stood up and walked over to the piano, mechanically fingering the notes. You know what's the worst thing? He planned everything in advance. When I was in the hospital, he managed to transfer all of my remaining assets to offshore accounts. He even took my wedding ring, it belonged to my grandmother. I showed her the documents I had collected on Holloway's current activities. The pattern was the same: charities, offshore companies, a complex system of transactions. He hasn't learned anything, Sarah shook her head. He has just become more careful. Greed got the better of him in Seattle, he wanted everything too quickly. Now he moves more slowly, covers his tracks more carefully. Why didn't you go to the police? I asked. She did. But they had no direct evidence of his involvement in the fraud. All the documents were destroyed, key witnesses were silent. James knows how to take care of details. I told her about Emily, about the clinic, about the Health Future Foundation. Sarah listened attentively, occasionally nodding to herself. He hasn't changed, she said finally. Same pattern: find a successful woman with assets, charm her, marry her, gain control of her finances. Then divorce and disappear. Your ex-wife will be the next victim if we don't stop him. Yes, we did. I still have some documents from that time. I didn't give them to the investigators, I was afraid of revenge. James knew people who could harm me and my daughter. But now, enough time has passed. Maybe it's time to put an end to this. She went up to the second floor and returned with a small box. Inside were a flash drive, some papers, and an old diary. Here is everything I have on him. Recordings of conversations, copies of documents that he did not have time to destroy. And most importantly, information about accounts in the Cayman Islands. I accidentally found them in his office shortly before the collapse of the company. He does not know that I have this information. I took the box, my heart pounding. This could be the key to exposing Holloway. Why did you decide to help? I asked, looking at Sarah. She walked over to the photo of her daughter on the wall. Because every time I see news of another financial scandal, I think, could it be him again? How many more lives will he ruin? My daughter grew up without a father and without the inheritance that was rightfully hers. I don't want other children to go through this. It was already dark when I left. The rain had stopped, but the air was damp and heavy. Sarah stood in the doorway, hugging herself. Be careful, Mr. Donovan. James is dangerous for more than just his financial dealings. When he feels threatened, accidents can happen. I nodded, understanding what she meant. I'll contact you when I'm ready to act. On the plane to Boston, I looked through the contents of the flash drive. There was enough information there to send Holloway to prison for years. But I knew documents alone weren't enough. I needed a plan to hold him accountable. My phone vibrated in my pocket, a text from Emily. I hope you come to the wedding. It would mean a lot to me. I looked out the window at the night lights below. I'll come, I thought. But not in the way you expect. I had only 2 weeks left before the wedding. The materials I had received from Sarah required careful analysis and systematization. I took a week's leave from the hospital, citing the need for an urgent trip to see my sick mother. My colleagues were surprised again. This was the second time in the last month that I had taken leave, which was completely unlike me. My apartment had become a makeshift investigative center. The walls were covered with financial flow charts, bank transaction printouts, and photographs of key figures in the West Coast Investments case. I worked almost around the clock, breaking only for short naps and cups of coffee. The information on Sarah's flash drive was invaluable. It contained not only details of the Cayman Islands accounts, but also personal correspondence between Holloway and his business partners. He was careful in his wording, but between the lines there was obvious fraud. I was particularly interested in a series of letters to a certain Marcus Stein, a banker in Zurich. I contacted a friend of mine at the federal prosecutor's office, Tom Reynolds. Marcus Stein, he asked. That name has come up in several international money laundering cases. An elusive character. They say he specializes in setting up complex offshore structures for clients with dubious reputations. Through my connections in medical circles, I gained access to the Health Future Foundation's documentation. On paper, everything looked perfect: research grants, contracts with clinics, patents for new treatments. But when I started checking out specific projects, it turned out that most of them existed only on paper. I was particularly alarmed by the contract for the development of a network of clinics that Emily was going to sign in a week. According to the documents, she was supposed to contribute all her assets as an investment, in exchange for a share in the management company. But this company had been registered only a month ago in the British Virgin Islands, and its only director was an unknown nominee. I knew documents alone weren't enough. I needed living witnesses willing to testify. I began searching for former West Coast Investments employees who might have known about Holloway's schemes. Most refused to talk, and some had changed their names and moved away. But I did find one person. Linda Parker was Holloway's secretary at West Coast Investments. After the company collapsed, she moved to Portland, where she opened a small flower shop. I flew out to visit her for the day. I knew it would happen again, she said after hearing my story. James is not one to stop. He's like a shark, he has to keep moving or he'll die. Linda said that she personally prepared the documents for transferring money to offshore companies. He made me sign non-disclosure papers, threatening that otherwise he would make it so that all the blame for the fraud would fall on me. I had a small daughter at the time, I couldn't take the risk. Now, years later, she was ready to talk. I recorded her testimony on video, had it notarized. Another piece of the puzzle fell into place. The next step was to gain access to the current financial operations of Hollow and Partners. Here, chance helped me. Looking through old photos from charity events, I noticed a familiar face, David Chin, a former patient of mine. I had saved him after a serious car accident 3 years ago. Now he worked as a financial analyst for Holloway's company. The meeting with Chin took place in an inconspicuous bar on the outskirts of New York. He was scared, constantly looking around. "What's going on in the company? It's crazy," he whispered, nervously swirling his glass of whiskey in his hands. "Holloway has created a real financial pyramid. The money of new investors is used to pay off old ones, but the scale of the operations is such that when everything collapses." Chin provided me with internal company reports. The numbers were shocking. Hollow and Partners managed more than $2 billion in assets, but no more than a third of that was actually invested. The rest was a cleverly disguised Ponzi scheme. I knew time was running out. Emily was due to sign a contract with the Health Future Foundation in 3 days. I had to act now. I collected all the documents into 3 folders. The first I sent to the New York City Attorney General's office. The second to the FBI, Financial Crimes Unit. The third I prepared for Emily. Holloway sensed something was wrong. I was followed. A black SUV with tinted windows would show up near the hospital and my home. One evening, someone tried to run me off the road onto the highway. I survived only because of the extreme driving skills I had acquired in my youth. It was time to go all in. I called Emily and asked to meet. "This is about James," I said. "And your safety." We met at my apartment. She came in irritated, sure that I was just trying to ruin her wedding out of jealousy. But when I started showing her documents, her confidence began to melt. "It's impossible," she repeated, looking at the financial flow charts. "James can't, he loves me." "How did you love Sarah?" I asked, and showed her photographs of his first wife. I told her the story of West Coast Investments. I showed Linda Parker's video testimony. Emily sat silently, pale as a sheet. Then suddenly she jumped up and rushed to the phone. "I have to cancel tomorrow's meeting." "The contract." I almost gave him everything. At that moment, the door of the apartment burst open. James Holloway himself stood on the threshold, and behind him were two strong men in dark suits. What a touching reunion of former spouses, he smiled his trademark smile. "I hope I'm not intruding too much." But his eyes weren't smiling. They held the cold fury of a man cornered. I stepped between him and Emily, fumbling in my pocket for the emergency button to call the police. It was the longest minute of my life. But help was already on its way. Police sirens tore through the evening silence. Holloway jerked toward the door, but it was too late. FBI SWAT was already climbing the stairs. He was taken right in my apartment. At the same time, the capture teams entered the office of Hollow and Partners and Holloway's house. The operation was prepared for several days. I worked closely with the feds from the moment the documents were sent. As Holloway was led out in handcuffs, he turned to me. "You do realize you'll never find the money, right? It's hidden well." I smiled back. "The FBI already has the Cayman Islands account information. Sarah says hi." His face was distorted with rage, but the Special Forces soldier was already pushing him towards the exit. Emily sat on the couch, her head in her hands. I sat down next to her, not knowing what to say. She looked up at me with tear-stained eyes. "Why did you do this? After everything I did to you?" "Because I once swore to take care of you through thick and thin. Some vows never expire." James Holloway's trial began 3 months after his arrest. During that time, federal agents conducted a massive investigation that uncovered more crime than I could have imagined. Hollow and Partners turned out to be the tip of the iceberg, a network of shell companies that laundered more than $3 billion over a decade. I sat in the courtroom every day of the trial, watching Holloway's empire of lies crumble. Prosecutors presented more than 1,000 pages of documents and questioned dozens of witnesses. Linda Parker testified via video link, still too afraid to show up in New York. Sarah Holloway testified in person, her testimony about the events in Seattle one of the key moments of the trial. David Chen, my former patient at Hollow and Partners, was a particularly valuable witness. He kept a secret file of all the company's suspicious transactions, made copies of documents, recorded conversations. "I knew the truth would come out someday," he said under questioning. "I wanted to be prepared." But the most shocking testimony came from Marcus Stein. The FBI tracked him down in Zurich and offered him a deal, complete immunity in exchange for information about his clients. The Swiss banker agreed. Via video link from the American Embassy in Bern, he described the complex money laundering system created by Holloway. "It was a brilliant scheme," Stein said in his soft German accent. The money passed through 7 layers of companies in different jurisdictions, changing form at each stage. Investments turned into loans, loans into insurance payments, payments into consulting services. By the time the funds reached the final accounts, their origin was untraceable. Emily had to give evidence too. I could see how hard it was for her to talk about her relationship with Holloway, how she almost fell into his trap. She was brave, but I could see her hands shaking when she talked about the contract with the Health Future Fund that she almost signed. He knew all my dreams, she said, not looking at Holloway, who was sitting at the defense table. About expanding the clinic, about creating a network of medical centers. He offered me exactly what I wanted most. And I almost gave him everything I had. Holloway's defense was based on an attempt to portray him as a victim of circumstance. His lawyers argued that he had been held hostage by the financial system, that he had not known about the illegal nature of the transactions, that he had trusted his subordinates. But the evidence was overwhelming. The jury was particularly moved by the story of Robert Kane, the founder of West Coast Investments, who committed suicide after the company collapsed. His widow traveled from Seattle to attend the trial. The gray-haired woman took the stand with dignity and described how Holloway had manipulated her husband, gradually pushing him into increasingly risky trades. Robert barely slept in the weeks before the company collapsed, Ms. Kane said. He knew everything was falling apart, but James kept telling him there was a way out. Just a little more money from investors and we'll fix it, he said. Meanwhile, he was already transferring millions into offshore accounts. In the jury box, I saw tears in the eyes of several women as Mrs. Kane described finding her husband's body in his office. Holloway sat motionless, staring straight ahead, his expression unreadable. Prosecutors painstakingly reconstructed the chain of events, from the first scams in Seattle to the final operations in New York. They showed how Holloway learned from his mistakes, making each successive scheme more complex and difficult to track. You're looking at more than just a con man, the lead prosecutor said in his closing argument. You're looking at the architect of one of the most sophisticated financial scams in history. A man who turned deception into an art form, who exploited the trust of the people as a tool for his own enrichment. The jury deliberated for only 6 hours, a remarkably short time for such a complex case. The verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. Fraud on an especially large scale, money laundering, tax crimes, creating a criminal community, more than 30 counts in all. Judge Harrison, an elderly African American with a reputation as the toughest federal judge in New York, announced the sentence, 25 years in prison without parole, forfeiture of all property, and a $100 million fine. Society is based on trust, the judge said, looking at Holloway over his glasses. We trust doctors with our lives, lawyers with our rights, financiers with our money. You have abused that trust in the most cynical way. Your actions have damaged not only individuals, but the very fabric of society. Such crimes require the harshest punishment. As Holloway was led out of the courtroom, he paused for a moment next to me. Are you happy, Donovan? He whispered. You destroyed everything I spent years building. You ruined it all yourself, James, I replied. The moment you decided you could play with other people's lives. After the verdict, the difficult work of finding and returning the stolen money began. The FBI created a special task force that was tasked with tracking Holloway's assets around the world. The information obtained from Sarah proved invaluable, helping to find more than $800 million in accounts in various offshore zones. Emily threw herself into her work. Her clinic continued to grow, but she was now more careful with investments and partners. We began to communicate more often, at first on business, then just like that. Old wounds began to heal. Sarah Holloway received compensation, some of the money found was returned to the victims of the fraud. She was able to pay off the debts left after the collapse of West Coast Investments and provide for the future of her daughter. Linda Parker has returned to the financial sector as a compliance consultant, helping companies identify suspicious transactions. Her experience working with Holloway has proven useful in her new role. David Chen got a job at the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC. His knowledge of the inner workings of financial fraud helps the regulator prevent such crimes. And I returned to my work at the hospital. Patients, operations, endless shifts, everything as before. But something in me had changed. I realized that justice is possible, even if the path to it is long and difficult. Sometimes, as I pass the county courthouse, I stop and look at the statue of Themis above the entrance. Her scales are still balanced, her sword still sharp. And I know that somewhere in a federal prison, James Holloway is counting the days until his release, which is a long time away.